All right. So, yeah, we had a few more people join. That's great. So tonight, as Tim mentioned, we are recording the event. So a week from today, it'll be up on our YouTube channel. And you can send the link to anyone and everyone who would love to watch it. We also have disabled the chat for tonight just so that we only have to juggle so many things. And instead, if you could just put all of your questions into that Q&A box down at the bottom. Try and limit it to questions rather than commenting as you would in a chat, just because it's a lot for us to sort through, and that way everyone can get their questions answered. And then if you have not been on one of these before, I'm April Williams. I'm the head of marketing for Backyard ADUs. If you get our newsletter, attending any of these events, or follow us on social media, I'm the person behind the scenes there. And then Tim, you want to go ahead with your introduction while I get some of the stuff on the back end started?
Great. Yep. I'm Tim O'Reilly. I'm the director of pre-construction. So everything on our side, designing, permitting, and planning. I'm based in Massachusetts, so I'm heavily biased towards that. And then Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Chris Lee. I'm the current CEO of Backyard ADUs and the original founder. And I'm still kind of got a little hand in everything as we continue to grow. And then I've got my daughter Lucy here with me tonight. She's not doing anything for Backyard ADUs yet, except for being cute on webinars if they're at 5 o'clock on a Thursday. And she will behave for at least 20 minutes.
And Chris is based in Maine. So together tonight, we're going to tackle our two big regions. And we're also launched in New Hampshire. We got a little bit of New Hampshire content tonight, but we're building our wealth of knowledge there as well. So I'll share my screen. We'll get things kicked off. And please don't hesitate to use that Q&A tonight. It makes for a much more interactive experience.
And if you have put a question in the box, I do see all of your questions. It might just not be the perfect time to ask it. So whatever's left at the end, we'll make sure to get your question answered. So don't worry if you hear me asking other people's questions and you had already entered yours. We'll get there.
Great. So I mentioned earlier, for those that showed up on time and early, Backyard ADUs was founded around 2019. And since then, we've been growing and building a lot of ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and small homes. So along the way, we've built our knowledge, cut our teeth on dealing with hundreds of municipalities between Massachusetts, and Maine, and along the way learned a lot. So our goal tonight is to keep it high level. We'll go and get a bit granular on a lot of different topics, but I'm sure as we go through there, you may have specific questions to your town. And we want to make sure we're here for you as a resource. So you can always contact us afterwards and we'll be here to answer your questions. So we're going to keep it high level, look at sort of standard permitting. What's a normal building permit? What does it take? What are some additional permits that we're often seeing? And then what are stumbling blocks? What are the things? Chris and I have a wealth of stories, and we could get up on our soapbox, but we're going to talk about some of those. So big picture. There's not a lot of small homes. In fact, there's a shortage. We know there's a housing shortage. For the past 40 years, subdivisions, people have been building bigger and bigger houses. And often the people that call us and we pick up the phone, they're looking for a more manageable solution for themselves, for their family, for their children, for their friends. And ultimately, it's about redefining and rebuilding what works for our communities. So why are we here, Backyard ADUs? Chris founded this in 2019. It all started when a neighbor posted on Facebook and said, "Hey, I'm looking for a place for my mom. I want her to move closer to me, to be closer to our family and to her grandkids." And we've been off to the races since then. The foundation, the underpinning of accessory dwelling units is the rules, and towns allowing that to be possible. So across our region here, even in the past 5 years, 6 years, a lot of exciting stuff has happened. In Mass here, the Affordable Homes Act was just signed into law in August, and this past February came into effect. So the ground has been shifting and moving in an exciting way. LD 2003 in Maine passed in 2022. Backyard ADUs was honored to host a press conference announcing that, and with all the important legislators involved. And we've been helping influence and advise on that legislation for a lot of the reasons we're going to talk about tonight, because the rules, awesome, those need to work, but it has to be all phases of the game here. What does it actually look like, boots on the ground building? Across the region, Vermont expanded ADU requirements, and New Hampshire, they had their law that was passed in 2017, but they're looking to revamp theirs here in the next legislative session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so things have been getting a lot easier since we permitted our first one of these in East Hampton back in 2020. But there's still a lot of roadblocks. Luckily, we don't have special permits anymore, which we'll talk about that. But there's still some of this stuff to deal with permitting, and that's why tonight's called the realities of permitting today.
So I'm a little biased here to Massachusetts, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Affordable Homes Act, which like I just mentioned, has really come into effect here in the last 6 months. And it's really exciting for those living in Massachusetts because it's allowed, or it's leveling the playing field, saying, hey, this is allowed by right, getting rid of the special permit process, which, as we'll look at here, involves a lot more outside professional costs and time, which affects your total timeline. So in the nitty gritty here, the state law basically mandates and says, hey, these are things that towns can add, but there's going to be a baseline where municipalities cannot manipulate the rules. And so at the state level, the owner occupancy requirement is gone. The special permit process is gone. They've set in here and said, hey, you may need one more parking space, or if you're near an MBTA transportation infrastructure, that parking requirement is waived. So this is helping remove some of these rules that typically could have stymied a project. Hey, maybe you didn't have enough space for that additional parking. Maybe owner occupancy didn't work for you or for your family for the long term. And hey, maybe your town wasn't very friendly when it came to the special permit process. So those are all gone. They did leave, of course, 300 and some odd towns here in Mass. We're all very particular, let's say, and have our own sort of flavor in different towns. So at the state level, they said, hey, municipalities can come in here and impose reasonable restrictions, which is the key language here. So over the next couple months, there'll certainly be lawsuits in various towns where the town may come in and put in a rule, and is it a reasonable restriction or not?
And that's the key thing. That's the key thing that we're going to look at more in detail as we proceed here, is who's enforcing these things? What permitting path are you going to need to go through in order to basically comply with the municipal rules that are still allowed to be enforced? So, for example, like site plan review requirements, you're still going to be going through a planning board permitting process. Title V requirements, you're going to be going through a permitting process with the health board. Regulations and dimensional setbacks, you're going to be going and doing that through the building commissioner or the code enforcement officer, depending what state you're in and what they're called. And then short-term rentals, I think that's pretty distributed on how that gets enforced. It's usually enforced after the fact. And I think that typically falls on the code department. But there's a vast different number of people who are still putting their hand in the pot that you're going to be getting to know as you try to permit an ADU.
Yeah, and regionally, that's what we'll sort of see. I know a lot of towns on Cape, short-term rentals can be a real issue. There's a lot of people who want to do that, but towns may come in and say, hey, we're going to restrict it to X number of days for a rental or things like that. We're going to look at a bit in terms of Title V. You need to meet Title V requirements if you're on a septic. The site plan review we're going to look at in a second, and then dimensional setbacks, bulk and height structures is basically saying, hey, you got to follow the rules for your district. But again, what's reasonable? If they come in and put, hey, maybe more strict requirements on heights. I know one town was proposing to say, hey, no accessory dwelling unit can be taller than 20 feet. Maybe in that district you could build, if it was a single family house, up to 35 feet. Is that reasonable? Yes or no? That would be on a case-by-case basis. So site plan review, we're getting into the weeds here, but just to keep it high level, the special permit would be gone, but they could still say, hey, you need to come and present. These are our rules. Show me the site plan review to basically say, do you check all the boxes? This is often a rubber stamping. So there's sort of a lower level of criteria to meet. An example that comes to mind is Northampton. They're very, very ADU friendly, but we still need to prepare our packet, present it to the planning board as part of their review process, wait for all the paperwork to get filed, stamped, bring it across town to the registry and back. Probably adds easily 2 months to the permit timeline. It's not a heavy lift. You don't need to hire a lawyer or get into crazy, engineering or site plan fees, but we still have to follow the rules and do that. And under the Affordable Homes Act, towns can implement this type of restriction.
And Tim, the other one that comes to my mind is Falmouth down on Cape, where I don't think they probably have changed their process, but I remember when we did our first two there, we had to do a planning board site plan review and a ZBA review sign off. So we had the opportunity to present twice over 3 months. And I guess fortunately both were rubber stamps. And I think I remember the ZBA saying at one point, we are not going to hold up a housing unit over 2 inches of pitch on the roof. Please move on.
We did have to change our site stakes from fiberglass stakes to fiber stakes. So I haven't got back in. So right now, a lot of towns are updating their requirements. So Falmouth certainly under the new rules had to get rid of the special permit process with the ZBA. But they may still require the site plan. I'd have to go check, Chris, but I think I blocked that one out of my memory of how many trips I had to make to Falmouth to get up and say, are we okay?
Yeah.
So what does it mean? What is this? Everyone's talking about by right, permitted use. This is basically going to the building department with an application for the building. And we're going to look at sort of the pieces of those puzzle. It's generally easier and faster. A lot of towns here have, and since COVID here, switched over to an online permitting process, which requires some technological expertise, town staff members to get oriented to the software. But it's generally pretty quick. Hey, I create a login, pull up the address and start my permitting process, which has been great.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Just because you're talking about it being easier and faster, one of our questions is, does the new ADU process make environmental permitting easier?
Yeah, we're going to look at that here in terms of conservation. Unfortunately, no, we're still beholden to, state rules, which, are here to protect.
I can say, Tim, one of our guests tonight can attest to that, and the fight we've been having in his hometown since is it October? No,
earlier.
April.
We submitted everything in September,
August?
and we've
we're still waiting
off
to
to
be
the
able
races.
to dig a hole in this large property.
Yeah. So April, we're going to come to that in a minute here when we get into conservation stuff, and that in this particular case and other cases can dovetail sometimes into Title V work as well. So best case is the rules are really well defined, and it syncs up with if it's an online permitting portal. Worst case, hey, you're still filling out a piece of paper, you're writing, a paper check, you're printing all your materials, and you're bringing a whole packet with however many copies they require into that office, getting it stamped that they received it, and then calling the phone and saying, hey, have you had a chance to review it? Do you have any questions for us? The worst case, or what we're seeing often, is where's the gray area? Every property is different. Every use case is different. So is there something that's not written? I'm trying to think of an example, Chris, of a CEO's interpretation where something wasn't black and white. I'm thinking about one project out in Western Mass. All of our engineered details were all set, and it wasn't clear or not whether ventilation was required to a crawl space. And so that was, hey, it's not clearly in the building code. It's not clear in this, and it's up to a CEO's interpretation of that. What was your example, Chris?
I think a good one, it's not necessarily black and white. So Massachusetts is unique that it has an approved plumbing materials list. And there's only one town in Massachusetts that thoroughly reviews that list and holds you to different fixture connection points, and that's Northampton. And we've been in that town, for example, we've had to throw away perfectly new water heaters that are allowed in all other 50 states, except for Massachusetts, apparently.
Well, that heater then became on the approved plumbing list 5 months later.
5 months later, I have one in my camp, and it works fine. But that's an example of that municipality takes that requirement as incredibly black and white to their own demise and to the impact of homeowners and expense. And other municipalities are not enforcing that black and white. And you get it in both ways on something that should be fairly prescriptive. But that's, yeah, so I think that kind of goes to say, it's like, as you're doing this, something that should be yes or no, sometimes it's not. And sometimes the ambiguity can play against you or for you, depending on who that building official is.
And so as we look at, hey, we're getting rid of the special permit, I just wanted to highlight, the good news here is in that special permitting process, it's often, hey, this is where neighbors or abutters or people opposed to the project come, stand up, and can throw a fit. We had a personal experience, where was that, 2020, where we presented a project to the zoning board. The neighbors got up, it got pretty ugly. And long story short, the homeowner decided, I'm going to move out of this town because of how nasty this hearing was. The town recognized how that sort of got out of hand, and like 4 months later changed their rules and got rid of the special permit. So that was before the Affordable Homes Act, but now statewide, that process has gone away. And Chris, could you just speak to Maine with LD 2003?
Yeah, Maine was just before Mass in making it so you can't do special permits. So everything is through building permit. Some towns in Maine have similar like additional interests that make it difficult still to permit ADUs. Portland is one of the few. I think the biggest difference in Maine and Massachusetts is a lot more communities in Massachusetts make it difficult to permit things for lots of different reasons that have nothing to do with special permit. And we'll keep touching on some of those.
Great. So often as we're looking at, hey, this is this building permit, we also need to think, what are our utilities on site? And these are going to require other permits. So high level here, we're looking at, are we public sewer? Are we septic? Is this public water? Are we on a well? And then there's a few municipalities that have their own electric services, but otherwise we're looking at, National Grid, CMP, or Eversource to say, hey, what do we need to do? What's actually the work that's going to be required? And then how are we going to do the permits? What are the permits? What are the fees? And all that. So Title V is going to govern our septic systems. We're going to look at that. Wells also relate to that in terms of separation distance. And then public DPWs we're going to talk about as well, with sewer connections and water connections. An important piece here as we're looking at filing a building permit is, are there any overlay districts? Are there any additional rules that we need to follow? So it's often, whether it's a shoreland, a water supply district, we've built in a wildlife corridor habitat district where they had regulations on fences. They wanted to make sure deer and other wildlife could migrate across properties. So we're always, you have to go through here with this fine-tooth comb to make sure all of the requirements on your specific property in your town, in your zoning district. So this was an example in Falmouth as we were working on those two projects. One was in that wildlife habitat corridor. I can't remember if the other was in one of these wellhead protection or shoreland overlays. One was near a pond. There was a special pond overlay, and we had to go and get the wetlands delineated and prove we were X number of feet from these various buffer zones.
Yeah, I think
So-
the key flag that these throw up is that these overlays usually are a signal that you're going to need to go in front of a board for the rules to be reviewed and agreed that you're in compliance. So these are usually flags that you're going to have a longer permitting process, and you're not going to be just dealing with the building commissioner or the CEO.
Along the same lines as that, it says, a question was submitted saying the planning board review in an earlier slide, it said it's a public format. Does that mean that neighbors have the right to complain, and can neighbors hold it up if you follow all the ADU rules?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's important to provide clarification. So I'm thinking of that example in Northampton. Hey, we get up, we present to the board. The board does take public comment. But in theory, when the board is making their decision, it is based on their rules and the application. So there is an element of a public forum there. But typically it's you're presenting it to the board to say, hey, these are the rules. This is our project. How do they mesh?
Yeah, I think the
Yeah.
key thing with comments from neighbors, I would kind of want to asterisk my comment here, but I would say very rarely is a neighbor going to come to the table with a comment that is truly going to block your project from being able to proceed, like something that they found that is truly not in compliance with the zoning bylaw that was missed by municipal staff. What is more likely the case is that neighbor is going to come with something, and I'll use the word petty, and they're just there to try to voice their concern and be heard. And their role in this situation is going to be to make the process take longer and to make it hurt a little bit more. And in our experience in dealing with that, it just means you might have to do another hearing and another hearing. And what happens is people get tired, owners get tired, and they just bail, and they just don't feel comfortable living with their neighbors anymore as a result of that interaction. On the other side of it, if your neighbor is very wealthy, if you happen to live in Lexington or Concord or Newton, or where there is a much higher income, and your neighbor may have $5-10 million sitting around and time to spend it, you may get lawsuits filed. And this may go to mass appellate court in order to review a decision.
Yeah.
The good news is, under the new Affordable Homes Act, is that person's got to post a bond for $250,000 that they could lose if they are proved to just have no on their thing. So they could lose a lot of money now. So neighbors have been kind of put in their place, I would say, when it comes to needing to raise concerns that are legitimate to their privacy or to their use and value of their existing property. And then I say that because we did start off very concerned with how ADUs would impact a neighbor, and it is a valid concern. But a lot of times what people are afraid of is change. And I think what the new rules do is it makes people really think, is this a change you're worried about? Or is this really that my backyard's going to be ruined? So anyway, there is something in place that's going to prevent that, regardless of whether or not you're going in front of a hearing or not.
And I'll extend that as well. You know, our slide earlier was talking about the site plan review. We're going to talk about conservation hearings. I didn't make it on the slides tonight, but we recently went through 2 different historical commissions. We're going to look at health boards. These are other meetings that also have a public forum component where neighbors can get up and say things. Like a recent one we permitted in the Old Kings Highway Historic District in Orleans. The neighbors got up, and it was just throwing mud at the wall. It was, is this really a real site plan? You know, can you build, is a modular unit? Is it going to be on a trailer with wheels? Are you going to be able to see it from the street? They were really worked up and throwing anything against the wall. In this case, the commission was fantastic. They said, hey, these are the rules of which we govern. This is the way this project meets all of our rules. If you have any concerns that relate to these rules here, that's what we're here to govern. We passed that hearing that night. We didn't have to, like Chris said earlier, said maybe continue to the next hearing in a month. or 2 weeks and delay and drag the process out.
Do you have
Great
any
question, though.
experience with challenges for building in historic districts, specifically on Cape Cod?
Yeah,
That
that
one
was
too, for
one
sure.
in Orleans. We're building one right now in Brewster where we had to go. This is a great example. Old Kings Highway, obviously, covers many, many towns in the Cape. Each town, though, has its own board that governs the same set of rules. So what we could do in Orleans under the Old Kings Highway, we were allowed to do vinyl siding on an accessory unit in the backyard, not visible from the street. Similar set of circumstances in Brewster. Their board for the Old Kings Highway Historic Commission absolutely would not, under any circumstances, approve vinyl siding.
Mhm.
So we had to do some back and forth and some jockeying and figure out, what was acceptable and not, even though it was the same set of rules. So there is sort of a human element there of a board. Ultimately, we decided what was in the best interest of the homeowner was to get moved in with her life circumstances. So we're not going to fight, right? We're not going to delay several months. We ended up pivoting, changing to cedar shakes. It costs a little bit more, but she gets to hold her construction timeline. We set that house last Tuesday, and she's going to move in about 4 or 5 weeks. So,
And I think
yeah,
the other one I'd say too, I see we've got a representative from Provincetown who's been helping us try to get ready for Provincetown's historic check. And I'd say like we haven't had the opportunity to actually permit that project yet in Provincetown. But from what we've heard, that one is one where it may be a little bit political. But it also is probably one that's going to be a very difficult, maybe drawn out fight in order to make sure we can approve this new 3-family and make sure that it does meet the needs and the look of Provincetown, which is a very unique community in terms of why are people coming there. And then another one coming to mind, I think we've glanced briefly at Newton and some of their historic areas. The one that I think scares me the most in a historic district that might be required is if one ends up requiring a slate roof. That's the kind of thing that I think could be a deal breaker for something like a small ADU just because of the expense. But again, I think the key here, these boards are generally reasonable and generally want to work with you. And I think it's the exception that they're going to be completely in your face and not want to do it. You just need to realize they're people and have a conversation with them and try to work out what's going to work.
and that's why we started tonight with that that slide about housing. These boards, they are people. They understand in our communities the desperate need for housing. And that's often been our experience, is willing to work with you to say, hey, we're on this board to satisfy these rules. This is the project in front of us. Do we need to make some minor adjustments to make everyone feel good about it? HOAs is another thing we've run into, and I get this question a lot is, hey, I'm in an HOA, how might that affect me building an ADU? Often we're catching this at the level when a surveyor is going there and looking at the deed records, pulling up covenants. Sometimes we're finding this at the feasibility study level, but it really does depend on how long ago this was made and what records are available. But if there are covenants in there, they typically supersede town regs. So we got to look them up and find them and see what's in there. HOAs are typically not enforced by the municipalities. So we got to look at the municipal rules and the HOA rules. Some municipalities are saying, hey, we won't approve this. I want to see your HOA approval first to make sure that, all the boxes are being checked here. But honestly, the enforcement really does vary. We've built several projects that involve covenants. This is an example. These covenants are from 1978. They go way back. They, sort of predate our current, housing situation, the ADU rules. We were able to build the ADU in this case, no problem. So yeah, I wanted to address that. So when we're looking at our standing building permit, you're looking at timelines, outside professionals, and costs. What does it take? What do you need up front? Often you're going to need a stamped site plan from a professional land surveyor, but it is not always required. When we're working in more rural towns, or maybe there's bigger lots, maybe there's not concerns about being near a setback. or things like that, it may not be required. Here in Mass, most of our projects, we do, we do get one. It is required. Working with Backyard ADUs, we're going in there, doing all the design work, getting our stamped engineered set, which we'll need for that building permit. If stormwater is required here, there's a couple different levels there. We have engineering in-house for straightforward, sort of dry well scenarios, but sometimes more is required. And we're going to look at that a little bit later, what some cost implications might be. If we're working with a septic, we may need a licensed septic designer or sanitarian to design and stamp that plan. And then to that question earlier, Averill, if there are conservation concerns, we'll need a wetland scientist to delineate those wetlands, or surveyor. If we're doing a survey, we'll grab those delineations, and then depending on the outcome, we may need to file the appropriate paperwork with the Conservation Commission. An important note here, the wetland scientist does need to do that delineation. They don't often have to do the filing of the paperwork, but depending on the project, they can. So they do the delineation, they file all the paperwork, represent you at the hearing, as required in the town under the circumstances of the project and the law. As we get into actual, building and construction here, there's other professionals and permits that we'll need. Plumbing permit with the licensed plumber, the electrical permit with the electrician. I put asterisks here because there are sort of technicalities here of the homeowner exemption if people felt like that's something they wanted to take on. But typically, the plumber, the electrician, they're pulling their permits. Certain towns do require a licensed drain layer, which, what the heck is that? I haven't known anyone who went to school to be a drain layer. What it is here, we're seeing this a lot in Metro West, where the town says, hey, you need to pay us a fee. You need to come to our class in order to get on our list of folks who are licensed to lay, water lines, drain lines, et cetera, in their town. So if we are going and working in a new town where they require that, our site work partner may need to do the training and pay the fee to get on that list.
Yeah, and I think what we see with that, I mean, I always kind of am a stickler here. It's just one more rule, but unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of leaky sewer pipes that are installed incorrectly in Massachusetts or in Maine or New Hampshire. But this one comes into place to fix a problem that may or may not exist. But it does create a pretty big hiccup. When we've had to deal with this, I think it's added several months to our projects trying to find a licensed drain layer in these communities, because what happens is it's a relatively easy bar to find somebody, or it's a relatively easy bar to get one of these licenses. But there's not really that many people that have them. So it kind of pushes you into a very small list of professionals and an even smaller schedule and availability. So it makes scheduling the project very difficult. And inevitably what happens is this small group of people who have this license, they have a ton of demand for their service. So as is human nature, they charge a little bit more for their service. So you end up paying $15,000 to lay down 2 lengths of PVC in a backyard. And it's part that they're busy and can do that, but it's also part by the town adding this layer of requirement is they get nervous about doing it exactly right to the very specific engineering spec and getting the exact right underlayment of crushed stone and sand and layering, that they get nervous and they're worried about liability, so they charge more for it. And again, it's like, this is one of those things that's an incremental improvement. But for policymakers that are on the call today, it's one of those things that as we think about what's a reasonable regulation and how do we boost more housing, is this one of those things that we should be allowing municipalities to regulate? Is this one of those things that maybe should only be allowed to be regulated in a very dense place like Somerville, where if there is a leaky sewer pipe, there could be a public health problem? But should it be regulatable in a place like Lexington or Concord, where that leaky sewer pipe is unlikely to have an impact on a neighbor in any real way? But anyway, soapbox, I'm on it.
Yeah, and I could think of one example where it was like, hey, the town's really willing to get new folks on that list, but we only offer the class when 5 people have signed up. So we don't actually have a date and schedule when the next, when you can get on that list. So it throws a kink in the grand scheme of permitting and scheduling and having an impact on housing production to address the housing shortage.
I don't.
We've
And if
also
you've
seen
been to Maine, well, one more bad comment. If you've ever been to Maine, it stinks really bad here, and it's because we don't have any licensed drain layers. I promise. Sorry.
All right, we've done demo before. Some
Um,
interesting things we've seen is, let me just finish this one, A
Okay.
Rose. We've been asked for a rodent inspection in one municipality for tearing down an old cottage. We've also seen hazardous material requirements. One we had to do is like, hey, they had their house sided in the last, honestly, it was a handful of years. Hey, we still need to go test the brand new hardy board siding to see if there is asbestos in it. So, there can be sort of these blanket requirements that aren't always, in context of the scenario.
And hazardous materials is fairly common, both in Massachusetts and Maine, and that definitely to protect both the people that are going to be doing the demo, but also neighbors. The rodent inspection one is the first time we saw that was in Deerfield for a project that we're working to get to a build schedule right now. And that's actually interesting. Rodent inspections, I think it's more common in places where they're trying to cull rat populations. I think it's probably common in Alberta where there aren't any rats. But we were surprised to see it in a community like Deerfield where I didn't know they had a rat problem, or I didn't know they were worried about a rat problem. And would be very interested in kind of the history of how that one got in place.
I am highly reeling you in right now because we're not even halfway through the slides and we have 15 questions
Okay,
and we
we'll
have
keep moving.
15 minutes.
I'm zipping it.
All right.
One quick question that I had was that someone had put that our property is adjacent to the town line. Do we need to involve the neighboring town in our process?
That's a good example. I actually own a piece of property that straddles 2 towns, and I don't want to deal with it. But if you're fully in one town, you should be fine. If you need a survey, that would be one key of the process. Hey, confirm you're fully in that one town. What's your zoning district? Go from there. Are there other questions, or should we keep moving?
Oh, there's lots of questions. You want to do a question segment real quick?
Why don't you grab 1 or 2, and then,
Okay.
then we'll
What
keep
is the
going.
general? I guess questions. Let's get some
A
questions.
lot of people I've sent to our YouTube channel. I put the link in our chat, and so even though you can't participate in it, there is some info there. Because a lot of these are topics that we covered deep dive in other webinars. So, one question. Could a statewide drain layer license be more appropriate than a municipal level license, similar to an electric or plumbing license?
I'll answer that. I think the question is whether or not we need licensed drain layers. And I think that question needs to be asked in a serious way. And I think if we're going to do that, there needs to be data that is presented supporting the need for licensed drain layers. I think that's how I would answer that one.
And I just clarify in our experience, the plumber is responsible for within 10 feet of the foundation. So that plumbing permit does cover, like, we've built an ADU that's attached to the house. And it's within 20 feet of the existing structure, 10 feet off the ADU, 10 feet off the main house. It's the plumber. Plumber owns that line. It's under the plumbing permit. It's regulated. So to Chris's point, do you need that licensure for, maybe 30 feet of a trench? That ADU is 50 feet away from a main house. The plumber has to own part of it, etc. All right, let's keep going. So conservation is one. I just pulled up a plan that we're working on here. In this case, we had wetlands that were partially on their property, honestly, mostly on the neighbors. We had to get the wetland scientist out there to delineate, show us this line here, the edge of the BVW. Then from there, we draw the 20-foot no disturb, the 50-foot no build, the 100-foot buffer, and then not shown on our map, 200 feet away, we'd be in the clear. So conservation in this case, hey, this was identified. We had to call the wetland scientists, get on their schedule, pay them, $800 a grand to get out there and delineate. The surveyor then has to go after, grab the lines. Where are the flags? Where's the delineation? Go back in the office, update our zone so we know where's our ADU. Hey, in this case, we're within the 100-foot buffer. We're between 100 and the 50-foot no build. And then from there, there was a lot more work that had to get done. We had to, as part of this plan, let's see if it's on here. Tree protection, construction fencing, silt socks, make sure everything here was out of the no build zone, et cetera. So a lot of work on that front. This probably cost all in $20,000 to $25,000 worth of infrastructure work, and included in that is to say, hey, who are all the professionals who needed to design and make this plan? So this is an example of this lot. So, hey, we had to have the silt sock, the orange fencing. Our zone of work here was away from that. This is another example in Weston where, in this case, we had to do 2 layers of silt sock and then all the plantings in between. Upfront professional services. This was probably $20,000 of work to prepare these plans, present them to the town, get it all done. In addition to the actual on-site, we need to buy the silt sock and install it, buy the plants and install it. And then in this case, there's 3 years of monitoring of these plants to make sure that they're alive. So it's not something to take lightly, especially as we're working in Metro West, where they're very much sticklers about all things conservation. The Board of Health is going to be another one. Sometimes, you're on a property that might also involve conservation, but here, this is everyone in our state who's on a septic. So we need to get approval for the size of the system, the design, how we're changing it. We're going to look at that in a bit. But I just wanted to highlight here, the permitting logistics is not only getting the professionals out there to design a new system, submit it to the town, but sometimes you actually have to go and present to the board. We're doing this right now in Lexington. I pulled up their meeting agenda here. They only meet once per month on the 3rd Thursday. So if you do not get your materials in, et cetera, if you go and present at a hearing, but it's inconclusive and you have to continue to the next one, you can very clearly see how your timeline of permitting can just get elongated and dragged out. And that's honestly been our experience here is, hey, you need to submit everything in advance. Comments are coming back. If comments don't get resolved before the hearing, you're pushed to the next hearing. And it can really drag out the process.
Yeah, it's all about time. It's really all about time. All of this permitting makes these things take a lot longer. And a lot of the people that we're working with who want an ADU have a family member who needs to move in right now. Something has happened. Something has happened that changed their health. They're getting older. And in a year and I'll be a little bit morbid on this. If somebody's 75 and they only have 10, 15 years of life left, a year of permitting is a long time to wait to move into your kid's backyard.
And I grabbed this picture here because this is an example where we needed to replace the tank for the main house, and the ADU and the main house shared a tank. This work all took place in one day. The old tank was pumped, the new tank was brought in and installed, and they only had one day during the working hours where they couldn't flush the toilet. The actual work here to install this system all in was probably 2 or 3 days. But this is the big exciting day where this huge giant concrete tank was installed. So it's like, hey, how can we make this work? How can this be a little bit more reasonable? Because in the grand scheme of things, this work is not rocket science.
Good Lord, look at that timeline.
Yeah. The other stuff here too, this is another example of a tank replacement. They're quite dramatic photos here. This tank got pulled out of the ground and ripped up. But the rules here govern, Title V here in Massachusetts, governed by the DEP. weren't necessarily written with ADUs in mind. And here we are with a new state ADU set of rules that applies to all municipalities. There needs to be some lobbying and some adjustment here, because what we're seeing is we're needing to typically install a new tank, either just to serve the ADU or to serve the main house to the ADU, even if we don't change the number of bedrooms on the property. And so a little bit more care and thought needs to be put at the state level in order for the infrastructure here to make sense and be a little bit more streamlined.
Yeah, I think the point I would make here too, and people from Massachusetts on this call, I think it's very important to remember that the people installing septic systems are licensed by the state. They've gone through training. The plans in which they are installing to are done by licensed engineers who have professional liability that their design was correct. So you've got a professional engineer who's on the line for their professionalism and legally, and then you have a licensed installer who's also on the line from a license. But still, the municipalities will have a board of health who's reviewing both of these professional groups and can hold up the septic work by easily 2 to 3 months. And again, we sound like we're whining on this. And I think the key thing is, at the end of the day, as a builder or as us or anyone, you're going to follow what is told to you. You're going to push back on behalf of your owner in order to save them money and to save them time, but you're going to do what the town says. But I think overall, a lot of this stuff needs to be thought about in terms of what is the impact and what risks is it actually alleviating in life safety or public health.
And that's a great point. And that's why I highlighted this tank that's in the ground here is a very expensive tank that is basically macerating and ejecting solid waste. This is in a backyard. It's for 1 bedroom and ADU. And this was an instance where we went back and forth of what is required from the engineer who's stamping this, but also from the town of what they want to see in their backyard. So a lot of different pieces of the puzzle here, but we bring in the right professionals, and there needs to be sort of a balance to make sure we fit what the goal is here with housing.
Oh, this is a good one.
Oh yeah, this one's great. So what all this boils down to, and Chris, thank you for bringing it up. We don't want to sound like we're whining here. We're just trying to talk about sort of what our experience has been, but time is key. So what does that really look like here? I grabbed 2 examples. One was a zoning board of appeals process. So this is obviously before the Affordable Homes Act, but this is a look into the town's portal. These are all the different things and reviews that we had to go through. We logged in online, we filled in all our information. Of course, it starts with a payment. You got to pay the toll. But it had to go and touch all these different parts of town within town hall, including the hearing, including the decision letter, including the appeal period, including getting it filed at the registry of deeds. And then the one on the far right here is one that we're working through in another town. Hey, it's easy to go in there and submit that permit, but everybody else has to look at it. And what often happens is there's other departments that require, additional fees or permits along the way. So, hey, did you fill out the paperwork for the fire chief and submit a $35 check for the smoke alarms? Okay, we got to do that. And you can't move through the process until that happens.
And I think the
as the
point here, Tim, like on this list, we're looking at this list. In some towns, this list might represent. I'm sorry, you can take back over. Sorry.
Yeah. It's just, this is the timeline where things take long. So it would be hard for us to sit up in here and say, hey, it takes 4 weeks to get a permit. One permit on Cape, it was like, man, why is this one taking so long? Finally went into the town office, and each of these different departments had people on vacation. So it was sitting, in one person's bucket waiting for them to click approve, but no one was actually in that office that week. And then it got pinged to the water department, same deal. So it can be a little bit tricky as it moves around. Additional permits, we've been talking about conservation, Board of Health, etc. This is where things can really drag out and longer. So what I just grabbed here, the Conservation Commission calendar. Hey, what's the meeting date? But you do have to submit your stuff weeks in advance. And that's because they want to review materials, get out legal notices. Are there any supplemental documents or changes? Everything has a deadline and needs to get in. The other thing that's not inherently clear in these schedules beyond the meeting is when do you get an approval? Chris brought up Lexington earlier. The Conservation Commission may vote to close your hearing one night, but you got to come back 2 weeks later in order for that to be officially signed off. And then your appeal period starts. You have to wait through the appeal period. Once that's over, you get your document. Then you got to go bring it to Cambridge to the Registry of Deeds, get it registered, and bring it back. So the dates on paper aren't always reflective of real life timelines when we're trying to get into that building permit stage. And I think the other thing to highlight here, in addition to the time, is what are the resources? So, Backyard ADUs or any other builder, are you hiring an outside professional to do this? Is your builder doing it? What are they charging you to do it? How much time does it actually take to do all of these steps along the way? And all of that here, our point at the bottom is it doesn't make housing a scalable because of all these steps. It's not necessarily easy to do. And if we're trying to fill our gap and our need for housing, we got to find ways to make these processes more streamlined. So typically permits, you got to go through this gauntlet and de-risk it. So you're going to wait until you have your permits in hand, and then you're going to schedule your construction. And so, your builder may be working on another project while you get your permits, and hey, now we're ready, we have our permits. We may not be able to start for a couple months or a couple weeks. Backyard ADUs has some, internal processes building off site. We're able to finagle that a little bit just to streamline that. But really, how does that affect housing production? It's these longer lead times, and it does trickle down to costs. So how much time is built into your proposal, and what are you getting charged for all these steps that it takes to get that permit? And then unfortunately here too, when we're looking and you hear about like labor shortages, our workers need to be furloughed because, hey, this project isn't going to now start for 3 months. And the labor pool is tight and it's skilled work. So we've been talking a little bit here about, Title V and whatnot, but DPWs, town water, town sewer are also factors here. So, do you need a special permit to connect to the water line or the town sewer? Each town, even though we have state ADU rules, each DPW will come in and layer what they might need. And we need to figure that out up front, at least here at Backyard ADUs, where we're doing fixed cost pricing, to understand what are the costs, and then of course translate that to timelines. So it's been our experience here cutting our teeth working with various towns. What do you need to do in each town, and what are the associated costs? I know we're a little tight on time. How are we doing on questions, April? I just want to gut check where we are.
Some of them kind of knocked out. A lot of them are relating to kind of what we do, what we don't do. Some quick ones. Can the municipality tell you the max square footage?
So the state rules here now set, 900 square feet or 50% of the main house, whichever is smaller, and that is using the gross floor area. So that would include basement space. So the town could come and layer in maybe some reasonable restrictions, but no, for size, that's set by the Affordable Homes Act.
Great. And if your ADU is on town sewer and water and is constructed completely within the home, not near wetlands or any historic districts or any other overlays, what do you think the time frame is to start construction?
So you still need to do all those required steps in order to be able to get a permit. So if you need a professional land surveyor, you'll need your designs and stamped engineering set. Here at Backyard ADUs, we're doing a feasibility study, which typically takes 1 to 2 months to get. And then from there in our design process, it's taking 8 to 12 weeks. So 3 to 4 months, 3 to 5 months to do all the required work up front in order to get the permit. And then at Backyard ADUs, typically we don't have all those extra stops along the way. Construction typically takes, once you sign a contract, the house is shown up 3 to 4 months later, and we're trying to finish them in typically 6 to 8, sometimes 10 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we do have some questions about fire safety, but I know you have some slides
Yeah,
about.
we got a slide to look at that in a minute. So
Okay.
why don't I keep going and we'll circle back. I just wanted to highlight here, these were, we brought up Concord, man, why does this look so expensive? They have very specific requirements of, they want a mini manhole for the sewer connection. We have to go around the main house. We have to move the water meter to the front yard. So depending on the site and the actual conditions, this gets expensive quickly. You need the licensed drain layer. Now we have a lot of trench, a lot of pipe, a lot of work. Whether you're building, 700 square feet, 900 square feet, we have to do it and follow their rules, right? This is what they set and say. They also say, hey, if your water line is more than 50 years old, you got to replace it. We have a house coming in Concord. We have to do just that. We have to replace the water line to the main house and then do all these around the horn utility connections, which in their case, they're lucky. They're pretty close to the road. But other folks in Concord we built for weren't as lucky. Hey, we had to cut open your driveway. We had to tear up your landscaping. It's tricky. So I won't dwell on that too much. This was one I just wanted to highlight. It said we had to run in, we had septic stuff along with, town. So, hey, town water, but Board of Health. We had to deal with town engineering plus the Board of Health, plus bringing in a septic designer, plus the drain layer to get this ADU in the backyard. Stormwater, we could do a whole webinar on stormwater. And we're learning a lot here, especially in Metro West. But like that plan we looked at earlier, and here's an example of it. We basically had to put in a huge underground retention and leaching system for all the roof runoff, along with a bioretention rain garden. Professional services, this was probably $15,000 worth of engineering work up front. Plus the surveyor need to go out there and do all the staking. Plus, I can't remember where this one came in, Chris. The actual work to install all this was 20 grand, something like that, 15 to 20 grand.
It would have, as soon as we're getting into leaching facilities like that are actually done based on true soil analysis, it gets very expensive in a hurry. It does it adds up fast.
Yeah. So it's not always this intense, but it's something that, hey, this probably also added, oh man, this process didn't go to a board, but hey, you had to send it into town engineering, you get the comments back and revise the plan. And did we have the right 100-year stormwater data? This one probably added a month or so in terms of total time going back and forth. Yeah. Fire safety, this one applies a lot more in Maine than it is here in Mass. Do you want to speak to this one, Chris? I know you have more. You've dealt with a couple of these that required sprinklers.
Yep. Fire safety is a big one. Obviously, it matters a lot about protecting human life. No one wants to have someone die in a fire, and a lot of municipalities have been responding by requiring universal sprinklering on Homes of any size, of any likelihood to burn in a fire. And it creates a kind of additional permitting. I actually don't know of any Massachusetts municipalities that have universal sprinkler requirements. There are many in Maine. And interestingly, New Hampshire actually banned sprinklers in two family homes. And Maine is working on a bill to do the same. And the reason being that in these new houses that are all electric with all arc fault breakers, working smoke detectors, they're very airtight. They're very unlikely to be involved in a fatal fire incident. But anyway, sprinklers is one way that you may run into permitting issues or additional complications or additional professionals that you're going to have to interact with. Something more common throughout Massachusetts is fire setbacks between buildings. So maintaining 10 feet between buildings, or needing to change siding or roofing products to make sure you don't get fire spread. This is a big one as you get into more dense areas. Obviously, if you're in a dense burb of Boston or right in the downtown area, if one building catches on fire, you got to make sure the next building doesn't catch on fire, because that can cause a huge problem as far as life safety is concerned. And then Tim brought our Lexington project back up. They had some fire safety requirements out here where they did want to see space separation between the ADU and the house unless it was attached. But
Yeah,
something
and
that,
this comes directly from section R302 in the Massachusetts Residential Building Code. And so this was this example where we were 5 feet away. So we met the letter of the law there. If we wanted to be closer, we may have had to do additional preventative
yeah, sorry, I misspoke at
fire
10.
breaks.
5 feet.
Yeah, it's 5.
They're asking specifically about egress door requirements, if you know if anything about those.
Oh, that's a good.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
So in new construction, you're going to need to have 2 doors directly to the outside. So in all of our little houses, regardless of the size, you need 2 doors, and you need to try to separate them on either side of the dwelling. Not surprisingly, that can be really difficult to do in a 500 square foot house that's only 30 feet long. In Maine, you don't need 2 doors. So apparently in Maine are really unsafe in their little houses with only their 1 door to get out. In terms of converting space, there's going to be each municipality is going to enforce the rules a little bit different. So if you're trying to convert an attic or a basement, it's going to fall on the building commissioner to look at whether or not you're doing enough work where it's going to trigger a requirement to upgrade egress requirements. And a lot of municipalities are leaning towards pushing for upgrades for those egress doors. And quite frankly, in an older balloon framed building where you're trying to build an additional unit in the attic, they're probably not wrong in requiring that additional egress door, because that does create a very risky situation. If a fire were to start in the first floor, it may be impossible to get out of that unit. So it's just kind of circling back. It's new construction. It's very clear what's required. In conversion of space, it's going to be a little bit more down to what the building commissioner is going to want to see. And it's most likely going to be based on how much work is being done to convert the space. And more likely than not, you're going to need to make sure you have that correct egress requirement and basically across the line. Oh my gosh, getting late. Smoke alarms, carbon monoxide alarms, the correct terminated railings so you don't get caught going up the stairs, the correct size windows, the extra door, the stairs down to grade, the whole 9 yards is probably going to occur depending on where you're converting space.
Here's a good example on the bottom left here is a boomerang down on Cape. You see 2 doors. This is a really, really small house. But hey, we had to do it. It's part of egress here. And even in this small little house, I think we have 3 smoke detectors. No, we have 3. There's room off the back. Yeah. So it's all got to be above board, meet code, and all that good stuff. I know we're a little bit, we're past 10. I know, Chris, I'm sure you're juggling a lot. April, how many more questions do we have?
We have
I wanna make
5.
sure.
Let's do just a couple more. And anyone,
Great.
if you don't have your question answered, I'm going to answer some that apply to the most people. But if you have a really specific question, you can, I put in the chat, Rick is our small home advisor in Massachusetts. If you have a completely generalized question that has nothing to do with building your specific ADU, but maybe just out of interest, or if you're in a different region, you can send an email to info@backyardadus.com and it will go to the right person. And I've also included the mass.gov. If you go to their website and search Affordable Homes Act, you'll be given a slew of resources with all the links to all of the frequently asked questions, and probably more info than you even really want to digest. But
Yeah, and even if we don't get to you tonight, reach out. We're happy to help.
yeah, for sure. Oh, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Yes, Connecticut, Rhode Island. We have people from Vermont. We aren't there yet.
Oh, great.
But we're working on it. We're going.
Yeah, reach out. Well, happy to take a look, point you in the right direction. We're not serving those regions yet, but yeah,
And so, can you speak to why someone would have to have or demonstrate a substantial hardship to build an ADU?
Yeah, so they're probably getting into the variance territory, where you'd have to say, hey, these are the rules. I may not be able to meet those rules. You'd have to go into demonstrating a hardship. So I often say, hey, it's a variance for a reason. They're not given out very often, and those variances often have to come from. My aunt, for example, has a giant glacial boulder right in the middle of her backyard. That might be a way to say, hey, can I get a little bit of setback relief, as I can't build on top of a boulder. So you have to demonstrate, features or existing things why you might want to try to bend some rules. But generally across the board, you can't just say, hey, because I want to, or because this is convenient for me. That's not necessarily a hardship. But yeah, we've built a lot of ADUs in a lot of different circumstances before the Affordable Homes Act, a lot of different sets of rules. So there are ways to get creative. I'm thinking of an example where, hey, the town required we had to build a garage and then attach an ADU to it. Those are their rules. They stuck by it. They said, all right, this is an important housing unit for an aging in place individual. Let's do it.
Thank you, North Berwick, for that one.
I'm thinking of Abington. We had to.
Oh, we
Yeah.
did.
We haven't talked a ton about parking, but this is a unique scenario. The city I'm working to encourage ADUs in, New Bedford, is hoping to interpret transit station for the purpose of parking minimum as any bus stop. This would mean no parking requirements in most neighborhoods. Do you know of other towns in Massachusetts that have interpreted it this way? And is this going to work?
I personally don't know of any other examples. I think that's fantastic. It's in there as the MBTA bus, terminals, ferry terminals, train stations, etc. But why not apply that to a more local regional transportation? Because the idea is the same. Hey, where someone can live, they should be able to access public transportation. And I've lived in places before where I did not need a car, and it's great. You walk more, you're outside more.
I'd say that sounds like it's in spirit of the law, and I want to say it's public transit. I think that would probably work and fly. And I think the other comment on parking, unless you're in really dense areas, rarely is a parking requirement going to be a deal breaker for an ADU, because often the requirements of parking for a single family home are fully met in the driveway, and they usually or garage. So between a garage and the two spots in front of it, there's never any blockers on parking. It becomes a problem where you have 5,000 square foot lots, 6,000 square foot lots, and it's street parking. And there's only one spot that's uncovered on the property. And I'm not super familiar with New Bedford, but I think that the lots are probably large enough that parking's probably an issue not to die on when trying to work with ADUs.
And we've also worked with some towns where we said, hey, there is the ability to serve parking. You require parking. Does this parking need to happen now? Can we, hey, down the road, this could be expanded if needed. So I'd like to think there's some flexibility there.
Great. You want
Great.
one more? One more?
Last one.
Last one. I only have the town's plot plan showing the house and garage and the lives, done by a surveyor, but as a guesstimate. I can only find 2 pins. In Northampton, do I have to get something more done?
That's a great question. Reach out to us here at Info. We work a lot in Northampton. We'll be able to pull up your lot and help you figure out exactly what you need.
Yeah, all the last questions we have there are all a reach out scenario, so.
Cool. Well, great.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch then. We have your email. Reach out to us or we'll reach out to you. We do this all day. Our goal is to help, again, address this housing shortfall and help build better, stronger communities here. So we're happy to answer your questions, look at your specific lot and give you advice and guidance.
And go
Yeah.
to the YouTube channel. There's so many webinars this is the third one in this series. So we've done one on policy changes, we've done one on financing. And so a lot of people's questions can be answered in both of those. And Jeff and Sam did one on how to build an ADU step by step. So it gives you a whole checklist and things to expect along the way. So
Great.
thanks.
Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to come here tonight. I sincerely hope you learned something or it got the wheels turning on sort of how the sausage is made here in the background of what it takes to build an ADU and get the permitting done. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, April.
Yeah, thank you,
Have a good night,
everyone.
everybody.
Good night. Bye, guys.